What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Grand Theories, Episode 3. I am your host, Mark. This is a podcast where we explore lesser-known ideas that try to explain really big things about the world we live in. And before we get started, I'd like to give a thank you to the band Ksyatriya, who has provided most of the music that you'll hear on this episode. So if you like what you hear, I've dropped all the links into the episode description, so please do check them out and support them if you can. Alright, so today's episode is about a lot of things. It's about identity, unity, nothing, and everything. More specifically, it's about an idea called Gluon Theory, which is a solution to the problem of how something is an object. So what do we mean there? Well, let's take a house, for example. So why is a house a house? Why is it not just a collection of bricks and wiring and doors and everything else that makes it up? Why is it that all those parts become one object? This might seem a little bit of a silly question, but it's puzzled philosophers for a really long time. Gluon Theory provides us with a novel and mind-bending answer to this question. And in doing so, it provides the ultimate answer to the one thing that unifies all of us. So before we jump into gluons, we'll need to quickly go over a couple of elusive concepts in the world of philosophy. To start, let's talk about holes. Yeah, holes. There's a lot of different kinds of holes. Holes in your pants, holes you can dig, holes in the road. We can all imagine what a hole looks like in some form. But what is a hole exactly? This might seem like a really weird question, but it's one that philosophers have actually argued about for a pretty long time. As we know it, a hole is just a space. It's an absence of stuff in a place where you'd expect stuff. By this logic, some have argued that holes aren't actually objects. They're just spaces, absences, and they definitely don't have stuff in them. But this conclusion doesn't really seem right. On Earth, even though a hole will look empty, it's typically filled with air. Air, as we all know, contains oxygen, nitrogen, and a bunch of other things. So even though we can't see a hole, it's got stuff in it. On top of this, holes not only have a shape, but they can have physical effects on our world. Anyone who's ever driven over a pothole can certainly testify to that. All this talk about holes begs a bigger question. What actually is nothing? I mean, you think there's nothing in a hole, but it's actually something. It seems like defining what nothing is should be pretty simple. Nothing is just nothing, right? Well, not quite. We run into problems in trying to find an example of nothing in our world. As we've seen, air certainly isn't it. Let's take a more extreme example, outer space. In trying to imagine what nothing is, most of us will probably jump to outer space. But let's set aside the fact that physicists continue to discover that outer space might not really be empty. For the sake of argument, let's just assume that there are parts of space that have nothing in them, no particles or anything. Even here, to call space nothing seems incorrect. Space, after all, does have a shape. It can curve under the effects of gravity. And perhaps more importantly, we can pass through it, we can fill it, and in a sense interact with space. So it seems that even though we speak of nothing all the time in our day-to-day language, quote-unquote nothing as a real concept or object doesn't really exist in the universe. To continue our search for nothing, let's turn to the world of philosophy. In philosophical circles, many have spent much time thinking about a concept called nothingness. Nothingness is not an object, but it's a state of existence. A state that has no objects, no consciousness, no time, no shape, no existence or awareness of any sort. It is literally and truly nothing. Nothingness certainly doesn't exist in our lives. We can't see it or find it anywhere. We cannot even truly imagine nothingness because by imagining it, it's no longer nothingness. So how can we in any way access it? Some atheists generally argue that upon death, we move into a state of nothingness. It's a state of neither pleasure nor pain. It's just nothing. We aren't aware of any of it, and we're just not there. Now, even if you do believe that this is true, it's still not going to tell you what nothingness is like. Perhaps the best I can personally relate to nothingness would be going under for surgery. This happened once, and while I can't obviously remember being under itself, I can vaguely recall the moments just before and after. Using the surrounding memories, I can scarcely remember what it was like to lose my sense of time and existence between those moments. Now, even though that's not directly experiencing nothingness, perhaps it's the closest that we can get. And perhaps the answer that we're looking for here is that nothingness is something we truly can't access. So why are we even talking about or trying to think about nothingness? In fact, just by doing that, aren't we entering into some sort of strange paradox? Well, as it turns out, nothing has everything to do with the topic of today's episode, and that's where we bring in our protagonist, a gentleman named Graham Priest. Graham Priest is a British/Australian mathematician turned philosopher who specializes in logic. In 2014, Priest released a book titled One, and in the book he puts forward his solution to the long-debated metaphysical problem of what it is exactly that makes a bunch of parts into an object. To convey this problem, we talked about houses earlier, but let's switch it up a little bit to haystacks. In its most raw and physical sense, a haystack is just a collection of many individual pieces of hay arranged into some sort of pile. Now, if you were to, for some reason, lay out each individual piece of hay on the ground side by side, it would no longer be a haystack. At that point, it's just a bunch of hay that has no real connection. But once you pile all that hay on top of each other, at some point they suddenly become a haystack. They become one, despite nothing materially new being added to that collection. Why is that? Why is there this sudden magic moment that does that? You could apply this question to not only haystacks, but really any object, and many answers have been given, all the way back to the days of Aristotle. Some might argue that it's the physical process that allows objects to be arranged as they are, which assumes that responsibility. Others might go the more abstract, romantic route and say that it's the form or function of this new arrangement that really makes it into an object. There are a multitude of ways that you could go about trying to answer the question, but Graham Priest cites the argument of a philosopher named F.H. Bradley to suggest that none of those answers are going to be satisfactory. To illustrate Bradley's argument, let's switch it up from hay to people. Take me, for example. I'm made up of lots of raw material, lots of things. A brain, supposedly, a heart, a liver, skin, bones, so on and so forth. But again, what is it that takes all of that stuff and turns it into one human? For the sake of example, let's put forward consciousness as the answer to that question. So in this case, consciousness would be what binds all my parts together into one person. Well, according to Bradley, this isn't going to work. By adding consciousness to the equation, all we've really done is just add one more part to the collection. Now all we have is all the body parts that I mentioned before, plus consciousness. So now we need to explain what it is that binds this new collection of parts together. We have to now provide a new explanation. So let's say we come up with something really creative and well-researched to answer it. Well, in line with Bradley's thinking, it really doesn't matter what the answer is, no matter how good, because we will now have to explain what binds that new collection of parts together. All the body parts plus consciousness plus whatever this new thing is. And as you can guess, and as Bradley states, this can go on into the abyss of infinity. Now this may seem like one of those paradoxes which appears more like a sleight of hand trick than an actual implication on our reality. But whether you like it or not, this problem is hard to resolve, and it does bring up important questions about how our brains filter out our physical surroundings. And in Priest's book, he puts forward one way to solve this infinite loop, and he does it by tapping into nothingness. But before we can understand how his solution works, we need to talk a little bit more about who Graham Priest is. As I mentioned earlier, Priest is a logician with a background in mathematics. In the early 80s, he became one of the pioneers of a concept known as dialetheism. Dialetheism is the view that contradictions can exist. See, in classical logic, something is either true or it's false. Just about anyone who is or even isn't trained in logic will probably tell you that. But in the school of what is known as paraconsistent logic, something can be both true and false at the same time, and it's not a problem. Contradictions can exist in paraconsistent logic. The position of dialetheism fits quite snugly into this school, where things can be both true and false, exist and not exist, be tall and not tall, and so on and so forth. Priest was among the first to take on this position in a serious manner. As he puts it, dialetheists were held as quote-unquote crackpots for quite some time. He cites that maybe a small handful of Australian philosophers, say 5 or 6, were the only ones who were really taking the idea seriously for quite some time in the early days. But just like a good stock market investor, Priest put his money into dialetheism before it was cool. To exemplify the confusing nature of dialetheism, consider the statement, "This sentence is a lie." Now, if that utterance is true, the sentence, by definition, can't actually be a lie, and would thus also be false. However, if the statement really is false, then the sentence actually is a lie, and would thus seem to be true at the same time. So here we have a paradox that seems to have qualities of being both true and false simultaneously. For a long time, it was presumed that this just couldn't be the case. It had to be one or the other. The assumption was that some logician would be able to prove it one way or the other, and many did try. But as time has gone on, philosophy still hasn't produced a compelling and agreed-upon counterargument. It still seems that this paradox is simply just that, a paradox. And for a dialetheist like Graham Priest, there's nothing wrong with that. More and more philosophers have begun to take the ideas of Priest and others seriously. And as a reward for advocating for the school so early on, Graham Priest is broadly considered one of the leading dialetheists. And this puts him in a unique position to solve the problem we mentioned earlier about unifying an object. Let's get back to that problem. In 1, Priest offers a solution to this by putting forward an object called a gluon. For those familiar with particle physics, he's not referring explicitly to the subatomic particle which physically binds quarks together. But Priest does give a nod to it, as his gluon ultimately serves a similar function of metaphysically gluing objects together. So what is the gluon that Priest is talking about, and how does it work? Let's start by thinking back to me. Instead of being just a pile of body parts, I'm a human. I'm one object. Something binds me into that one object. As you might remember, if we were to suggest something like consciousness as my glue, we'd then just have to add that to the list of parts that makes me up and find some sort of new glue. And this will just go on endlessly. So how does a gluon get past this? The answer is both perplexing and simple at the same time. The gluon is both an object and not an object. More simply put, it is a non-existent object. In fact, logically, it has to be that way. If it existed, we just have to add it to that list of parts. It can't actually exist. Now wait, how can something exist and not exist at the same time? Well, this actually isn't as wild as it sounds. Think about fictional superheroes like Black Panther, Wonder Woman, or Robin. We all know that they aren't real. We can't go out in the world and find them. In that sense, they don't really exist. However, because we can talk about them, imagine them, even portray them, superheroes do exist in another sense. So because they have the properties of existing in one sense and not existing in the other, some philosophers would refer to them as non-existent objects. So I know that Wonder Woman isn't real, but to say that she hasn't had an impact on this world is silly. Wonder Woman has produced large amounts of inspiration and entertainment to many. Many have even reaped considerable financial reward through the portrayal of Wonder Woman in comics, TV, and the movies. So back to gluons. They both exist and don't exist, in the sense that while they aren't in the world, we can talk about and conceptualize them. So with that out of the way, what does a gluon look like? In true Priestian fashion, a gluon is many things at once. Let's take the gluon that makes me the person that I am. If you've just rewound the podcast, you can stop right about here. My gluon is an object that is perfectly identical to the whole me. At the same time, it's also an object that is perfectly identical to every part that makes me up. It's identical to my arm and only my arm, my consciousness and only my consciousness, my left ventricle and only my left ventricle, and so on and so forth, all at the same time. And there are gluons seemingly everywhere in the world. My cats have gluons, my TV, the earth has a gluon. Even some random piece of sand on the beaches of Chile will have one. And there are lots and lots of cuts of gluon. They can stretch out and change over time. Abstract properties like redness, beauty, and humanity can even possess gluons. The gluon of beauty, for example, would be identical to every single beautiful object that exists in the world. As time passes and the list of all this world's beautiful objects inevitably changes, so does the gluon of beauty change with it. Almost everything about a gluon is counterintuitive and contradictory, and because of that it can be quite hard to imagine it in the mind's eye. The best I can think of would be one of those composite images that overlaps many, many different photos on top of each other at once. But this doesn't really accurately conceptualize what a gluon is, and in fact, isn't really even necessary. A gluon is a metaphysical idea. It's literally beyond the physical. It's not its supposed image or physicality that is important, but its function. It binds things together through its being identical to the object as a whole, and at the same time identical to all its parts. Identity is literally the glue. And this idea on its own, while novel, may not seem too amazing at first glance, but it's what Priest is able to do with his new non-existent object that digs towards the roots of truth. Priest takes advantage of the gluon's strange properties to try to solve some of the most debated problems in philosophy. One of those is the problem of objects even being able to have identity in the first place. This is an issue that was prominently raised by a philosopher named Peter Unger, a dynamic, daring scholar who will likely be the subject of many more references in the future of this podcast. In the early 80s, Unger deeply questioned the nature of how things can even exist through what he called the problem of the many. Let's talk about clouds. Clouds by nature are vague things. Think of your standard cumulus cloud, just floating along through the sky, having a good time. Now, as you and I know it, most clouds have a pretty distinct, thick center. Clouds are white where the sun can reach them, gray on the underside, and appear very distinct when looking at them. But as a cloud gets out to its edges, it becomes more wispy, whimsical, more fragmented and incomplete. Not all of the parts at the edge of the cloud seem to attach directly to its base. They float along with it, but they don't really seem to be completely connected. Despite the disconnect, they could still be considered part of the cloud. But where is the boundary exactly? How far away can a little accompanying wisp be before it just becomes its own cloud? Depending on where we decide to put this boundary, one cloud could have seemingly millions and millions of different variations of what exactly that cloud is. The problem becomes even more amplified when you consider a pack of multiple clouds floating through the skies together. Now all of a sudden, these ambiguous boundaries of detached cloud parts begin overlapping with each other in multitudes. Deciding if a little wispy patch belongs to one cloud or its neighbor can become difficult to impossible. Multiply that by thousands, and suddenly the possibilities for where specific clouds begin and end begins to approach that infinite abyss. Now, clouds might be a special case, but this problem can be applied to some degree to all sorts of things, even people. Philosophers have proposed a variety of solutions since Unger first raised the conundrum. One of the more well-known of those is that because of this problem of vagueness, it's simpler to say that things like clouds just don't exist at all. Instead, these quote-unquote clouds are nothing more than a bunch of atoms arranged in a way to look and function as a cloud. Some philosophers hold that, in fact, nothing really exists or has distinct identity. In their view, the universe contains nothing but atoms, arranged in various ways to look like certain objects. Now back to Graham Priest. In his book, he puts forward gluons as a possible solution to the cloud problem. Because gluons have the capability to be multiple objects at once, one cloud can just easily take on all of its distinct possibilities at one time. The gluon of that cloud is what ties all of those things together. Priest also uses gluons to try to settle the issue of how objects can maintain their identity over time. To get into this, let's talk about amoebas. Amoebas are the simplest of organisms. their one single cell and some ectoplasm to protect it. Amoebas have a unique way of engaging in reproduction. Crudely put, the amoeba will make a copy of its own single cell and divide itself into two new and identical amoebas. Pretty cool, but Priest asks a fair question here. Where exactly does the original amoeba go? For the sake of argument, if the amoeba had a soul, where would its soul go after it divided? Would it be with one amoeba or the other? Or maybe both, or perhaps it just disappears entirely? This is a difficult question to answer, but once again, gluons can provide some potential insight. In this case, the old amoeba is simultaneously at and not at the location of the first new amoeba, and at and not at the location of the second new amoeba. This mind-bending possibility is only possible because of the new amoeba's gluon, which is identical to all three of the amoebas we've talked about. In many ways, these answers make very little sense through our earthly lenses. In that line of thinking, these solutions may feel meaningless, incomprehensible, and thus, perhaps, unexciting. Whether that means that these solutions require a deeper understanding of and connection to our world to fully comprehend, or that they're just wrong, is up for debate. But at this point, Priest has only begun to set the stage for a much wider, more complicated, but at the same time easier to swallow application of Gluon Theory. An attempt at what it is that underlies all of our ultimate realities. As we've seen, what makes you you or me me isn't as straightforward as one might tend to think. The little details are pretty tricky. But as we've seen, even though many have questioned the exact nature of our identities, all the solutions offered so far suggested that there is at least something there. But in his grand argument, Priest puts forward the idea that anything you can imagine, you, me, trees, starfish, the planet, the universe, is empty and filled with nothing. Now, how would that work? The premise, pretty simply, is this. All that we are is how we relate to everything that is around us. So, for example, I am the son of my mother. I'm the brother of my sister. I'm the boyfriend of my girlfriend. I am the former student of my third grade teacher. This list goes on and on and on, until listing out how I relate to every single object, no matter how closely or distantly related, in the universe. In sum, and if you're rewinding, you can stop here, I am who I am in this world because of what I am to everything else. To get a grip on that, let's go over a couple of quick examples. In the book, Priest puts forward the case of the North Pole. What is it that makes the North Pole the North Pole? As Priest puts it, precisely that it is not the South Pole. In fact, if the South Pole didn't exist, the North Pole wouldn't be north at all. And I'm not a scientist, but I would think that if the South Pole didn't exist, the magnetism that makes the North Pole what it really is would be thrown off quite significantly. Without the South Pole, the North Pole would be something completely different than what it is now. Let's talk about NBA Hall of Fame center Shaquille O'Neal. If you aren't a basketball fan, Shaq is a 7 foot 1 inch tall, 300+ pound, big, strong basketball player. He was in fact a fantastic player, and one of the things that made him so good was his size. Because of his mass and strength, he could easily bump his opponents around in order to get close to the basket and drop in a quick 2. Teams would often send 2, 3, 4, and even 5 players at him, but in many instances he would still just plow right through them. He was so tough to guard that teams would intentionally foul him to make him shoot free throws. Now when you think of Shaq, one of the first things that may come to your mind to describe him is tall. No one's going to argue that. But what is it that makes Shaq tall, exactly? Well, you may have guessed it, it's simply how he relates to other people in terms of height. Without other people to compare him to, Shaq can't really be described as tall. It wouldn't mean anything, in fact. Without other people, he couldn't even be considered short. He'd just be nothing in terms of height. Now this may seem inconsequential. We're just talking about descriptions, right? Maybe, but not quite. Because Shaq was so big and strong, he was able to sit close to the basket without having to really worry about someone shoving him away. If he wasn't tall, strong, he couldn't do that. It could be argued that Shaq was also less agile than other NBA players. As such, you wouldn't see him weaving in and out of defenses, using quickness to score. Now you might say, come on, Mark, isn't that an insult to Shaq? Just to say that he was good because he was big? Well, yeah, okay. Shaq was also a highly intelligent and highly skilled player as well. But the same logic applies to both of those qualities. Shaq often had more smarts and more skills than the players guarding him. This contributed to his ability to score. In this case, it's still, again, just a matter of relations. And ultimately, what you could do is make the argument that Shaq did what he did on the basketball court precisely because of how all of his attributes related to others on the court, and nothing else. So this might explain what our identity is, but how does this mean that we are empty and filled with nothing? Shaq, after all, is still a being who is made up of 7+ feet of matter, assuredly. Well, Shaq is just one of many things in this world. If you were to somehow lay every object in the universe out next to each other, you would have everything that there is. As we learned from Priest earlier, all things have their own gluons. In Priest's world, everything that there is has its own gluon as well. So the gluon of everything is simultaneously identical to literally every single thing that there is. And one of the objects on that list is nothing. So in that sense, it is safe to say that nothing is part of everything. Nothing flows through everything. And from this, Priest comes to the following conclusion. The primary way to determine what something really is how it relates to nothing. So even though how I relate to my father or my girlfriend is key in defining who and what I am, there isn't any sharper comparison than how I contrast with nothingness. Nothing is the ideal backdrop which you can overlay me and anything else as to be able to pick out individual features. It provides the clearest picture possible. And as it goes, the thing that everything has in common with each other is nothing. So in the language of gluons, nothing is the only thing that all of our gluons commonly possess. Nothing is what unites and flows through all of us. Nothing is what glues our parts into the things that we are. We are not our parts, we are just nothing, which brings together our parts. And it is because we are nothing that we can only be how we relate to all the parts around us. And because the flow of nothing moves through all things, there is no real distinction between you, me, and anyone else. We are all one thing and nothing. priest uses formal logic to ultimately build up to and support this highly contradictory conclusion. His logic, of course, is up for criticism from other qualified logicians. But the point here isn't, again, whether or not priest is right or wrong. The bigger purpose here is where all of this leads. To close his book, Priest draws a comparison between his premise that everything is filled with nothing and some core ideas in Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhism, there's a general idea that people don't really have a self-nature. What you see as your own self or your own identity is really just an illusion. Your ego is not really you, but something that's ultimately created and held up by your interactions with the world around you. If one is able to meditate long enough and deeply enough, the contours of this ego can come crashing down until you ultimately come into contact with the emptiness beneath it. To illustrate a world filled with empty beings, Priest calls upon an old Buddhist analogy called Indra's net. Imagine a beautiful, endless, decorative net where each connecting node is a transparent jewel. If you were to come close and peer into one of the jewels, you wouldn't actually see anything of substance inside of the jewel itself because of its clear, empty nature. All you would see is the reflections of the other jewels. Those close to the jewel you are peering in would appear the largest and most vibrant, while those further away, while still there, would be less noticeable. All you see by looking into a jewel isn't the jewel itself, but everything around it. As you may have guessed, this metaphor lines up pretty neatly with Priest's world, where beings are what they are in virtue of what others are. This is, of course, a paradox, as beings exist only when viewed through the lens of others, but not when viewed directly. But as we've seen, Priest likes paradoxes. In fact, he uses this paradoxical model to put forward some ethical ideas that also aligned with Buddhist philosophy. He asks you to imagine that there is a bright red light shone onto one of the jewels. Within the net, this light would naturally reflect onto and into the other jewels around it. The light would then continue to spread further down the net, albeit a bit more weakly each time, until a large number of jewels are to some degree also possessing that reflection. Now imagine that this light represents pain. In this model, one being's pain becomes the pain of many. The pain is shared and felt by others. While we could imagine this aligning with something like empathy, Priest cites medical studies to show that people can be physically affected by the misery of others. As a recommendation to deal with this interconnectedness, Priest suggests, in alignment with Buddhist practices, that people should ultimately strive for inner peace, and not just inner peace for themselves, but for others, even those that we might not like that much. Because in Indra's net, the fate of one is the fate of all. Inner peace is the one state that can calm our transparent nature, reducing the interference and the messiness that swirls inside of us and bounces onto others. In a world of endless inner peace, Indra's net would remain completely still, possessing a perfectly deep clarity. One thing that Graham Priest has said is that, historically, when cultures come into contact with each other, there is usually a rapid bursting of new philosophical ideas. Different traditions usually have competing ideas, and so in forcing them to come to terms with each other, new, stronger ideas will emerge. In one, Priest has practiced what he's preached. He's taken a problem that has been written about in Western philosophy for over 2 millennia and attempted to solve it in an Eastern manner. This is perhaps one shining example of what this fusion of traditions might look like in one instance. Priest has said that over the next several generations of philosophers, he hopes that these traditions will continue to come together in a critical way as to produce a type of global philosophy, undivided between East and West, North and South, continent and continent, etc. And Priest's wishes certainly feel compelling. The search for what is true can be difficult. We often have to weed through our own biases, desires, and mental blocks to get there. In coming together completely, philosophical traditions can continually shave the bad ideas away, leaving only the strongest and most valid in place. And in doing this, we sometimes have to dive away from what we feel intuitively is right. And perhaps Gluon Theory is an example of this. Priest has put forward a logic that challenges almost everything most of us think we know about the world. But this is part of the process. As Priest puts it, his only concern is the truth. And on a more cosmic level, it seems that humanity's search for the truth has only just begun. Once we arrive at a global philosophy, we should continue aiming to merge our ideas with cultures even further out. Should we ever meet and be able to philosophize with intelligent life on other planets, you better damn well believe that our philosophy would get flipped completely on its head. And we should want this. The truth doesn't care about our feelings or our attachments to the ideas that we've produced. In Priest's most recent book, The Fifth Corner of Four, he discusses an idea called the Chatuskati. The Chatuskati is a system associated with several philosophies, including Buddhism, which is used to determine the truth of a matter. As mentioned before, in Western philosophy, this system is typically twofold. Something is either true or it is false. In the Chatuskati, on top of being true or false, a proposition can be both true and false at the same time, or it can be neither true nor false. This more open-minded approach to the nature of truthhood seems much more in line with how Priest thinks. And in the book, he provides evidence that there may be a fifth element of the Chatuskati, that the truthhood of something can be ineffable. For something to be ineffable is for it to be just beyond the grasp of human language or understanding. Ineffability is naturally a confusing topic, because by nature it entails things that we cannot understand or even talk about. It's difficult to give an example of something that would be ineffable, because if we could give an example, it wouldn't be ineffable. Ineffability is roughly equivalent to our brains tapping out, acknowledging their limits and trying to understand something. But for something to be ineffable does not mean that it can't one day be comprehended. Our minds, after all, are imperfect tools. Compared to the physical nature of computer hardware, they are slow and inefficient. In fact, our minds are known to filter the world around us in a way that distorts the true nature of reality. In that sense, some argue that we will never be able to truly experience the reality around us, and that it will always be ineffable. One suggested way around ineffability is through the development of technologies like artificial intelligence, which can more efficiently process stimuli than we can. But on the other hand, perhaps another way to explore the ineffable is through what Priest is suggesting: the continual clashing of philosophies, the weeding out of bad ideas, and investment in good ones. To sidestep our biases in favor of the pursuit of the deep truth. And what we might come up with might look a lot like Gluon Theory, an idea that offends the inner workings of our minds simply because our minds cannot truly create a frame of reference for it. And while some may argue that that offensiveness just means it's a bad idea, others, including myself, may see that odd taste as a good sign, as a sign that we are making progress toward understanding the ineffable. Thank you so much for listening to the third episode of Grand Theories. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something new out of it. I know that was a pretty heavy one. Definitely took a lot out of me putting this together in the last month. So I'm thinking next month we're going to take it a step back a little bit, take it a little bit lighter. I'm looking at almost certainly happiness and living the good life as our next topic. In the meantime, if you haven't already, if you're not following me on Instagram and Twitter, at Grand Theories on Instagram and at Grand_Theories on Twitter. And if you could do me a favor, if you like the show, on whatever platform you're on, just 5-star it, subscribe, whatever interactions you can make, those go a long way in getting the show out there and hopefully making it more successful. Okay, thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you enjoyed the music, and we will see you next month. Take care.